the British introduced an alien political system into the country. This lecture will examine some of the experiences women went through. First of all, political. The head of the country's administration was the British government in London, who was represented by the Secretary of State for the colonies. The governor was the head of the British administration in Ghana, and he had executive, legislative, and judicial functions. In the regions, the government appointed chief commissioners, assisted by district commissioners. At the end of the political structure was the chief, whose main duties were to recruit labor and collect taxes. The queens were not at all recognized in any form. Although the British government applied a policy of indirect rule based on the belief that the European and the African were culturally distinct, and that the institution of government most suited to the African were those he had devised himself, for all intents and purposes, it did not work as expected. Women in Ghana were not deterred by the attitude of the colonial government towards them, and whenever possible, performed their traditional roles. When Governor Hodgson demanded the golden stool from Asante, it was Nana Yaa Asantewaa, Queen of Ejoso, who led the war in 1900 against them. Nana Yaa Asantewaa called on all the various states in Asante to take up arms and fight against the British. She lost the war and was exiled together with Asantehene Prempeh I to the island of Seychelles, where she stayed until 1924, when she was returned. In the military sphere, women exercised caution and diplomacy, unlike the pre-colonial period when they were very active. Women did the same so far as social activities were concerned. Traditional rites like puberty were carefully observed and not with fanfare. In the economic field, the women farmers played their pre-colonial roles of growing foodstuffs and collecting food plants. Trading continued not on a scale as in the pre-colonial era. Women were careful about their visibility, whereas in the pre-colonial era, they were so visible. Colonial government made things different for them. The colonial government refused to recognize the legitimacy of women's power in the various sectors of the pre-colonial system. They ignored the institutionalized power that women in traditional society held. Male chauvinism was dominant in Britain, and the colonialists felt that a woman was inferior and weak, and that her physiology and anatomy prevented her from performing well. The British had a protectionist attitude towards women, and this was reflected in their belief that women were feeble and were of the weaker sex. The British also intimated that a woman should stay at home and take care of the family. So to clap for all the women who have been able to combine the roles, domestic and elsewhere. The introduction of formal education in Ghana created additional avenues of employment. Women contributed to the country's development as teachers, nurses, clerks, and administrators. But this was not until a great breakthrough occurred in the 1890s. So now I turn to the colonial period in terms of the breakthrough for women helping in other areas of government work. In 1890, the first African woman employee entered the Gold Coast service. She was Miss Elizabeth Ferguson. Prior to her employment, Governor Bramford Griffith wrote to the Secretary of State in London to ask for permission to employ her. In a letter dated 18 September 1890, the governor wrote as follows: "My Lord, I take leave very respectfully to submit for your lordship's perusal and consideration accompanying documents relating to the employment of Miss Elizabeth Ferguson, a young native lady whose father is much respected at Anomabo, where he takes great interest in agricultural affairs, and may also mention that The young lady is a sister to Mr. George Ferguson, whom your lordship was so good as to permit to study for a year at the Royal School of Mines in 1889 to 1890. The letter of Mr. Ferguson, Sr., raises some interesting questions in connection with the employment of young women educated in the country, and points out how the educational values may be turned into account. My belief is that the services of young native ladies, properly trained, will be in many respects quite valuable to the government as those of the native male clerks who may be employed in similar work in the form. And I feel sure that I shall be consulting your lordship's wishes in finding occupation for them whenever suitable opportunities occur. Because as stated in my minutes of the 18th April last to the acting colonial secretary, I strongly incline to the belief that the admission of young ladies who are public service is calculated to have a most useful and moralizing effect generally in the service. I would add in conclusion that Ms. Ferguson has recently passed a second examination and is now postmistress and telegraph clerk at Anomabo. Very big post for the first woman. On 23rd October 1890, Secretary of State Nasford replied as follows: I approve of your action in this matter, and I concur in your view that it is desirable to employ young women who have been educated in the colony in the government service whenever suitable opportunities occur. After 1890, therefore, the government service, which had been predominantly male-dominated since its inception in 1821, was opened to young, educated women. I want to look at the recruitment of women up to 1956. Although the colonial service became opened to women, the account of the employment situation in the country in 1916 indicated that very few women, the numbers were not given, engaged in clerical duties in the service and in trading firms. The majority of women were employed in farming, trading, and panning, weaving, and catering. Yesterday, I talked about some of the traditional things women did, and it looked like women were still involved: the farming, the trading, spinning, weaving, and so on. 4 years later, the Gold Coast Education Committee reported that the careers open to girls who had passed through primary school were: 1, home life, marriage, motherhood, for the great majority; 2, hospital work as nurses; 3, district nursing and midwifery; 4, teaching, particularly in infant schools and in all girls' schools; dressmaking, various cloth weaving, basket weaving, and then clerks, typists, store sales women. The committee observed that the conditions in the Gold Coast will prevent for many years the employment of girl clerks for any great extent. It therefore recommended that the first effort should be to train girls for teaching, nursing, and similar careers. That is why there were so many female teachers and so many female nurses. Now male nurses have also joined the females. That is great. They are very welcome. In 1922, the governor's office expressed extreme difficulty in getting a number of trained clerks for the service. It was therefore suggested that, if possible, clerks be transferred from the service of another country, such as Nigeria. In 1924, Governor Gajisberg described as urgent the need for well-educated African men and women to join the government service. Besides the need of government, there was the need of the European firms, mercantile, banking, and professional. For the first time in the history of the government service, there was a passionate appeal for the employment of Africans because they had great potentialities. And Gajisberg outlined this in his book titled The Keystone. Gajisberg recommended that Africans be given a good education, an education not limited to primary and middle schools, but involving secondary and university colleges as well. It was only by providing higher education that Africans could be employed, particularly in the higher appointments of the government service. Gajisberg expressed dismay that the colony was turning out annually 4,000 to 5,000 boys only fitted to be clerks, and the governor devoted a whole chapter in his book on the importance of educating women. To this end, he suggested the building of a women's block in Nachimota School. By 1927, when Governor Gajisberg was about to leave the Gold Coast, it had become clear that more African men and women, though very few, had joined the service. In an address to Gajisberg from the African members of the service, the Africans expressed their deep gratitude to him for the many benefits that the African service had derived during his administration. They reiterated, the appointment of Africans of both sexes to fill offices which, prior to Your Excellency's assumption of the reins of government, were almost exclusively held by Europeans, has been welcomed. Your Excellency has labored to prepare the ground for the growth of an African section of the civil service of vastly increased importance, responsibility, and prestige. The signatories to the above address were 38 in number, and it included one female, namely Mercy Korte Papafew. In 1939, the effects of Gajisberg's educationist and Africanization policies became evident. 538 women were reported to have been employed in public posts throughout the country. The distribution of the women were as follows: 235 teachers in assisted schools, 110 women in the telephone service, 130 nurses in the medical department, 53 in the health department, of whom 30 were subsidized midwives. The public posts available for educated women was limited to 3 main areas of work. The Committee of 1938 reported that the employment of women in stores was non-existent, but there were few in factories. The majority of women were busily engaged in trade. Trade again, trade again. The numerical strength of the service in the 1930s was about 7,079, and women constituted 538 of this number. There was no woman in the higher ranks of the service in the 1930s and 1940s, but the appointment of African men into these ranks grew slowly and steadily. In 1954, the number of women dropped to 370, and the reason for this was not specified, and this was a time when the junior service alone numbered over 2,000. But unlike the 1939 situation, the women were not restricted to only 3 departments, namely education, health/medical, and post and telecommunications, but they were employed in over 40 departments as clerical assistants, typists, clerical officers, and stenographer secretaries. For the first time in the history of the service, 2 women were appointed executive officers. These appointments were made possible, firstly, because the Legacies Commission of 1951 recommended the abolition of structural barriers between the junior and senior services. men and women of ability could progress into senior positions. Secondly, the Africanization policy initiated by Gajesberg and vigorously pursued by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and his ministers in 1951. The recruitment of women into the service was largely limited to the lower ranks. The pre-independence service remained European male-dominated in the highest ranks, from the Governor Secretariat to the regional administration. This was because it was a basic policy of colonial rule to reserve the highest positions of responsibility in the service for expatriates. Consequently, the service was divided into European and African. All those African men who joined the higher ranks of the service were admitted to the European post. In 1945, Sir Harrigan recommended the abolition of European and African posts and the establishment of senior and junior posts. The Liberal Commission of 1950-51 brought further structural changes to the service by bridging the gap between the junior and senior service and introducing various executive grades. What were the qualifications into the Gold Coast service? The administrative class. There were 3 methods by which a candidate could enter the administrative service. The first was through an open competitive examination, but candidates had to possess a degree of a recognized university. The second was through a limited competitive examination, and the third was through direct promotion. In addition to these 3 methods of recruitment, the record stated categorically that females were debarred by these words, quote, "Candidates for entry into the administrative service who must in present circumstances be male are selected for appointment as administrative officer." The professional class. The qualifications for entry into the professional class were similar to that of the administrative class, but there was no mention of gender. The reality of the matter was that the educational level of women in the country prevented many of them from entering into this class. Then there was the executive class. Candidates for entry into this class were selected first through the limited competitive examinations and second through the open competitive examination. Candidates had to possess a higher school certificate or school certificate class 1 or 2. There was also no mention of gender in this class, but women were limited because of their level of education. The technical class. This class was opened to both sexes. A secondary school certificate or a certificate from a technical or trade school were what was required for entry into the class. Those who entered the class with a secondary school certificate were provided with technical and industrial training in the various government departments they entered. The clerical class. Up to 1950, the secondary school certificate was the normal requirement for entry into the clerical grade. I'm short-sighted, so. In 1950-51, the Liberal Commission recommended that special classes be created to take over from the clerical class, typing and stenography, and other sub-clerical work, because the employment of clerical officers with school certificates on work, which must properly be done by officers with lower educational qualifications, was a misuse of staff. I think this should go up a bit. Jedu, I think the light should go up a bit.
Should be on, right?
Yes, it should be on, but if it goes up a bit, it's too. Okay, if it down. Yes. Education. The entry requirements detailed above prove in no small measure that education was basic to employment in the service, and that primarily the level of girls' education determined one's position in all the classes. Throughout the colonial period, education was primarily the work of the various missionary societies, like the SPG, Basel, Wesleyan Mission, and the Catholics. It was not until 1909 that the colonial government started showing an interest in education. All the missionaries stressed the importance of education for both boys and girls, and built a lot of primary and middle schools, technical and trade schools, a number of secondary schools and training colleges and seminaries. Men and women who had been educated in any of these schools could be employed in the service, but only in the technical and clerical classes in the light of the pre-entry requirements. It is not surprising that in the 1920s, Gettysburg described the educational system in Ghana as inefficient and inadequate. Consequently, a number of committees were set up to study the state of education and make recommendations. In 1918, the Basel missionaries reported that after years of opposition with respect to girls' education, their schools had now progressed with a ratio intake of 2.7 boys to 1 girl. 2 years later, the Educationist Committee, headed by D.J. Oman, noted the low enrollment of females in education and adduced 3 major reasons for it. 1, the common attitude to women, an elemental sense of the place of women in normal primitive society. 2, the vocation of practically every girl in this country is prospective marriage and motherhood. For this vocation, the girl is prepared by her parents or guardians. As marriage in this country is early, it's necessary for school training. It inhabits the school training and it curtails it. And 3, the sense of the value of education for its own sake grows slowly. Unfortunately, the committee did not make recommendations which would break these attitudes. It rather recommended that curriculum in the schools be slightly different for girls because of physiological differences. Games was to be different, and those subjects which would help girls for future home life should be taught, namely sewing, hygiene, cooking, and general housewifery. It further recommended the establishment of a secondary boarding school for boys alone at Achimota, since the enrollment of girls in the various schools in the country was extremely low. Fortunately, the Felstow Commission of the same period, headed by Dr. Jesse Jones, with Dr. K. Agri as one of its members, modified the 1920 and 1922 committee's recommendations and recommended that Achimota School, instead of being confined to boys, should become co-educational. In 1926, Reverend A.G. Fraser and Dr. Agri traveled around the country to explain the idea of Achimota to the people. They emphasized the importance of women's education during these tours and summed it up in the words of Agri: if you educate a man, you educate an individual. But if you educate a woman, you educate a family. The word is family, not nation. The effect of the building of Achimota School on employment in the service was profound. Agbodeka affirms that most of the women employed in the 1930s were products from the school. The establishment of the University College of the Gold Coast in 1948 had little impact on female employment in the service because the number of women who entered the university was very small. Gender and the administrative class. The administrative class was close to women throughout the colonial period. In 1954, an application from a woman who was highly qualified. She had a master's degree in economics, 1954, Ghanaian woman. And this was Miss Gloria Nikwe, Mrs. Nikwe. and who was determined to enter the administrative class was met with the following response. It has been ordered that Ms. Dododo shall be informed that the reason why she cannot be considered for an appointment to the administrative class is that a woman is not at present deemed to be capable of fulfilling all the duties which administrative officers may be required to undertake. The lady was consequently appointed to another post in the service. Officials of the administrative class filled the most senior posts of the government departments. They were responsible for the main organization and control of the complicated business of government and for the management of the work of the various departments. Their duty was not only to ensure the smooth day-to-day running of the department, but also to face any major problem that might arise, find the solution, or if possible, forestall it, estimate the cost of staff, building, and money. They were also required to give a complete, balanced, and sensible picture of what the reaction of other departments of other countries did in various circumstances. The work demanded the greatest accuracy, precision, and lucidity in marshalling facts. Administrative officers in the regions were regarded as the general representatives of the government in the regions in which they were serving. They were to ensure that those policies which affected the general administration of the region concerned was carried out in an orderly and efficient manner. They were also responsible for the good government of the region and were entitled to receive, as the agents of the central government, any information which will help them to discharge their responsibilities. Unfortunately, women were not given a chance to prove or disprove the fears of the colonial government. Male chauvinism was dominant in Britain and in all Europe, America, Asia, and Africa. The colonialists felt that a woman was inferior and weak, and that her physiology and anatomy prevented her from performing well. There was also a protectionist attitude because the man who was stronger had to protect the woman who was feeble and of the weaker sex. The scheme and conditions of the Gold Coast service were very hard on women. All married women were employed on temporary basis, and they were entitled to annual leave, sick leave. They were not entitled to annual leave, sick leave, maternity leave, or pension. Pregnancy resulted in resignation from the service. Unmarried women who were employed on permanent basis had to notify their heads of department in writing if they married, and it was left to the discretion of the head of department to retain them or for them to resign. If they were retained, they enjoyed maternity leave with half 3 months' pay. But if they got pregnant and the second time, they were asked to go on pension. The situation remained as such until 1963, when Ghana under President Nkrumah witnessed great changes in the status of women. I want to conclude by saying that when one compares the roles of women that I mentioned yesterday during the pre-colonial period, visible in the social field, political field, in the military sphere, in religion, and in the economy, it is clear that the colonial experience was a very different one for women in the country.